Welcome to the Anatomy of a Strategy podcast. I'm Tara Hunt.
And I'm Carlos Pacheco.
And this week we have a very special guest who is connected to us by previous guest, Nilofer Merchant. His name is Dr. Tomas Chamorro. And you may have heard of his name. He had a pretty incredibly viral TED Talk, and then prior to that, a couple years back, and in a little bit of a viral article, I guess, on HBR, entitled, "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" A little bit of a clickbaity article, but I read the book, or we both read the book, and it was really excellent. He has been doing all sorts of great work and research over the years. He's an organizational psychologist who works mostly in the areas of personality profiling, people analytics, and leadership development. So he knows a thing or two about leadership and this problem we're having. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Dr. Chamorro. I think if anybody can tackle this particular hairy topic, it will be a well-educated man. And we can have a debate online for anybody who believes that or doesn't believe that. But I still think, due to a lot of the things he talks about when it comes to bias, it's important work he's doing, and I want to get the word out there.
Yes, let's get to it.
All right. I am so excited. We are so excited to be sitting here today with Dr. Tomas Chamorro, author of the very clickbaity titled book, but amazing book, "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" and how to fix it. I think I first came across you with your TED Talk, and then read the HBR article, which went a little viral a few years back. And then I got to see you speak here in Toronto. So welcome to Anatomy of a Strategy.
Thank you for inviting me.
So it is quite clickbaity as far as the title goes. I want to actually ask you a little bit about that title. Was that something that you had, because you talked about having written about this topic for a bunch of years, and there's something about this that resonates.
Yeah. So, I wish I could take credit for the title, but it wasn't even my idea. It was my editor, my HBR editor at the time at Harvard Business Review, who worked with me on the original article, which is actually 6 years old. So that article attempted to provide a different explanation to the uneven gender ratio in leadership than what Sheryl Sandberg had written at the time, when she just published Lean In. Long story short, the article did very well. In the past 6 years, every time an incompetent man was visibly elected to prominent leadership roles, the article went back to number one online. Yeah. And I rarely mention this, but sometimes I do tell people that, at least the idea or the suggestion to turn the article into a book was ignored or violently rejected by the same publisher several times on the basis that it might antagonize not just male executives, but the majority of the readers, because Harvard Business Review is read primarily by, some of the people who look quite similar to the people I describe in my book. And I kept on telling them, the publisher, don't worry. They mostly won't realize that it might be about them, because one of the central features of incompetence is lack of self-awareness.
Right.
And so my hope was always that they might read it and say, yeah, I know people like this, and they might enjoy it because they see that incompetence in others and not in themselves. Anyway, we finally did the book. It took them 6 months of ruminating as to how they would rename it, because the title was still perceived as quite, controversial. And in the end, they didn't just leave the title, but they put Incompetent Man in orange, which does stick out when you see it. So, I think it's quite a bold move for the publisher. And I think it's also a reflection of the changing times. I think as much as it's still better to be born male than female anywhere in the world, it is also true that there has never been a worse time to be a man in history, I think.
Interesting. Please do expand on that particular statement.
Well, although we are making very slow progress, it is true that if you look at the proportion of women in the workforce, the proportion of women in leadership roles, I mean, it gets obviously worse and not as hopeful or optimistic when you get to the very top. But
right.
On the layers down, the career obstacles for women have been lifted, at least in the industrialized world. And typically the rest of the world tends to follow that path. So, Argentina isn't as gender egalitarian as Canada, but people are having the same conversations. And I think if the title or the topic of this book upsets men, it's because they feel that their status quo is at threat. 20 or 30 years ago, they might just have laughed and see it as a humorous book. But today, it's pointing to a certain, I think, change in zeitgeist.
But it doesn't seem to be like a zero-sum. It doesn't seem to be working out to be a zero-sum game. I mean, unemployment for men isn't skyrocketing because of women entering or having a lot of education entering the workforce, right?
Yeah, and so here, I'd like to distinguish between workforce as a kind of a in terms of the mass volume, most people at work, and there we have to understand that conditions in the rich world have never been better. I mean, in most industrialized nations, we're seeing years of job growth where, for example, in the US, and I'm sure it's similar in Canada, we've had 2 or 3 years where there are many more job openings than people looking for jobs, So clearly conditions are better for most people, but that makes the case for needing more people at work more than ever. So if half of the people or a considerable percentage, a significant portion of the workforce is going to be ignored or overlooked or doesn't have access to jobs, you're going to struggle more. And then at the top, I think the issue is not can we increase participation, but can we increase the quality of leaders? And there aren't enough competent men to fill up leadership roles in a good way because the majority of people don't have as much potential for leadership as they would like or as we might need them, So it's a matter of increasing the sample pool from which we draw candidates, and we are self-harming in that regard because we don't consider women as having potential for leadership.
As I'm in that demographic that you're talking about, as a woman, I know in my own career, I'm now in my mid to late 40s, and it's, it was a lot. I've always felt like I had to work 10 times harder, be absolutely flawless. I remember, so I have had a speaking career myself. Early in my speaking career, the different conferences would do these surveys, and I would practice the hell out of my presentations. I would watch the other presenters, like 90%, 95% of them male. Some of them seemed really unprepared. I found they meandered. They didn't give much except for a lot of bravado. I put a lot of data and research into my presentations, and then they'd get the surveys back, and I was like the lowest rated speaker, and I just was like, I have to work harder, I have to be funnier, I have to pick up these things that these guys are doing on the stage, being more self-effacing or whatever it is. Do you find that that's changing? Or
well, this may sound, your story may sound like a very simple example, but actually it's a great example to highlight the complexities that underpin some issues. Firstly, on the issue that women on average need to be more equipped, better prepared, and actually perceive themselves that they are readier than men when they just volunteer for something or lean in. Typically, when we present data that reflects such effects, people say, oh yeah, poor women, let's make it easier for them to rise to the top or put themselves forward to it. And I say, actually, my point would be that no, it's working fine for women. Why don't we expect or demand the same level of quality control standards and even self-criticism in men, so that fewer men volunteer for things when they don't have the talents to back it up? Because when they do, we fall for it, and then it's a problem, right? So on that issue of how ready or prepared people need to be considered for certain roles or consider themselves for leadership or dominance role, I think it's working fine for women, but we don't apply the same quality control standards for men. So instead of making it easier for incompetent women to get to the top, let's make it harder for incompetent men to get to the top. And then the second point of your story, which I like a lot, is the fact that a lot of the times performance is purely a matter of perceptions. And this happens not just when women who may deliver a better presentation, a better sales pitch, or a better project are rated or evaluated by sexist people who might be men or even women, because there's bias in both.
Yep.
But also when managers and leaders are evaluated in things like 360-degree surveys or upward feedback, it's really hard to separate or disentangle the data that pertains to actual performance and perceptions. Technology can help us do this. So there was a recent study, for example, where women and men were monitored with sensors, right, that recorded everything they said, did, and how they felt and their emotional patterns for 2 or 3 months. This is an MIT spin-off study. And it showed that there were no gender differences in this company in what men and women did for this extended period of time. And yet, when it came to promoting those same individuals, men got promoted 40 or 50% time more often than women.
And is that you've studied some human evolution around this, or you have cited some studies. Like, is this to do with, is this like a vicious cycle where or is it biological that we see men as being more competent? Or
I think there are some elements that probably could be attributed to biological evolution, in our evolutionary ancestors. But then there is cultural evolution, and the two are intertwined in very interesting and complex ways. So yes, we have inherited archaic leadership stereotypes that still point to alpha male, kind of strong, aggressive, violent, fearless, and physically impressive creatures as more leader-like. Having said that, for a significant proportion of our evolutionary past, we were also led by leaders who displayed empathy, altruism, and intelligence, Right. So, and these things can change rapidly. I mean, I always say, instead of looking at how much it changes within the same country in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, which usually during that time frame we die and generations are replaced, So let's look at how it changes when you go from one country to another, even when you go from Canada to the US, or when you go from, the West Coast and East Coast to the center coast of the US, or from Britain to America, or if you compare the importance that things like self-criticism, modesty, humility, and curiosity have in South Korea or Japan compared to what we expect in Brazil and Argentina. So it shows, and we all come from the same place, so it shows that culture can really rewrite and reshape some of these archetypes. And so my goal, if I have one main mission, is to try to align our stereotypes and archetypes with the factors that actually contribute to performance and effectiveness, because right now they are self-destructive,
Right. So your goal can't just end with a book. How are you?
Well,
we come from a marketing firm, a marketing background, and that's mostly it's just like, how do you spread something, right? Like an idea, like a product, that sort of thing. For you need to spread this idea in order for what you're trying to accomplish with this work What are you doing to?
Well, so, you sit with marketing experts in every country you visit at 8 o'clock in the morning and have a conversation, hoping that they will have those ideas, right? So, I'm not going to seriously aspire to creating a big movement, but if some of the things I say can help those who are actively involved,
But why wouldn't you seriously aspire? Because I was thinking about this as I was hearing you, and then as I was reading the book, I was thinking, it's a bit ironic because an Argentinian male that has confidence. You obviously get up on stage. You have great stage presence. People are enwrapped in what you're saying. You have that ability to capture audiences with that. You talk about the charisma, et cetera. That is a myth and the confidence, but you can use it to spread a message.
Yeah.
Versus if I got up on stage, I would likely be called angry or shrill or something, like
the usual stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Where you have now the power to spread that message, and you can take those bullets in a different way.
Yeah.
Than somebody like me would.
And this is true, and I don't know if that's fair or unfair, or if I wish that it weren't true, but the reality is that it is true. Many of my colleagues, female colleagues who work in the area of gender studies, leadership, D&I, told me you realize they're only listening to you because you're a man and so forth. And I said, I know there is a bit of that, and that things like presentational skills or even confidence, the same things that I want to expose, help me deliver the message. But I think, precisely because of that, I feel that I have the responsibility to use whatever power or means I have to do it, which is no different.
Comes great responsibility.
Yes. Well, sometimes it's the other way around, but and I think equally, if you have spent a long time studying the science and looking at data, etc., and you feel that there is a disconnect between what the evidence actually shows and not just what is part of the typical narratives, but the implications that those narratives have when we focus the discussion just on quotas and we blame women for not leaning in and all these things. That is, totally at odds with what the science of leadership shows, which is that the characteristics that should be most in demand, things like altruism, empathy, people skills, self-awareness, humility, integrity, coachability, are on average found more commonly in women than men. Right. And this is not to say, okay, let's just select women. No, it's let's assess these things properly, and the gender ratio will fix itself. You
said that there's technology that's available where you mentioned, I think last night, some of the job sort of hunting sites. I haven't really come across any that have been super amazing at that, but maybe you know of some better ones.
I think the technology is clearly still work in progress, but the main thing that technology can help us do is to test whether something is working or not, and to de-emphasize the reliance on our subjective views or preferences, right? So the example that I think will illustrate some of this, if you think about an Uber driver, for instance, right? Yeah. Uber has a lot of drivers, and I mentioned Uber, but it's the same with all kind of ride-sharing cars or apps at the end of the day. But Uber has thousands of drivers. No human manager needs to be checking on them or speaking to them. It's virtually impossible for two HR managers at Uber to sit down and look at the same individual driver and have an argument as to whether they're doing a good job or a bad job. Why? Because the range of key performance indicators and of data that we have on their performance is very, very, it's not perfect, right? It might be that when drivers are female, they get lower ratings. If they're from an ethnic minority, they get lower, but that would just be one tiny data point. And at the end of the day, they're rated so much by others that it washes out. But then you have how many trips do they make? How much money do they bring in? Do they crash? Now, they get rated even on their playlist, on their conversation. So humans are still behind that data, but data is recording and monitoring this in a way that is not just more efficient, but also more accurate. And, it makes reliance on subjectivity and preference, human intuition, far less important. Whereas if you ask people, is Justin Trudeau a good prime minister or is Obama a good president? It's like a bar discussion on what's your favorite rock star or your favorite sports team. Data seems trivial or irrelevant, which is why people use any discussion on leadership to just project their own preferences, values, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so we like to use a mix of data and science, and you talked a little bit about like too much going with the gut, especially since our gut seems to fool us. But we like to mix sort of that art and science into the type of work that we do, because I also feel that there's in that art, in that softer space, not my first impressions, but looking for more values, I guess, that is harder to it's harder to measure, that really helps. Like, we have a very diverse team, and we will continue to do so. We're looking for certain things in our organization, one of which is like kind of a geeky passion for what you're doing. So if you're like a total introvert that is, maybe that can't even hold a conversation in a party or whatever, but as soon as you talking about, I don't know, Google Analytics or like how to do a content strategy, and you see people light up, like that's what we look for in our organization. And we actually have only have 2 men that are part of our organization, and a very culturally diverse group as well.
Yeah, and so, I think that, first of all, when you are looking at smaller organizations, you have the luxury that you can afford more time to get to know people, right? Yeah. Which doesn't scale very well if you're talking about not just multinationals, but also, people electing politicians who they've been exposed to, for minutes in the media. And secondly, I'm pretty sure that you still have a very data-driven approach when you evaluate people's resumes, portfolios, experience, which again, you can do because you have expertise. Yeah. But in most areas of talent identification, the people that are making the call don't have even the technical expertise.
How do you scale that? Like, I have to be in every interview and go through every resume.
It just doesn't work that way. Yeah. It doesn't work that way. And, I think even today, where most large organizations, would at least feel guilty if they admitted that they just hired someone because they liked them. Right. And in most of the civilized world, they might get sued if they don't have evidence to explain why they hired someone. You still hear companies saying, great culture fit, we'll fit right in, etc. And these things are directly inconsistent with things like, let's create a culture of inclusion and diversity. Hiring for culture fit will not increase the diversity, especially the cognitive diversity that you need to success.
Yeah, you get like you walk into an organization, you're like, you're all the same people. Correct. I worked in Silicon Valley for a while. It was very much like that, where I would be either the only woman in the room, or I'd walk into rooms and there'd be very few people of color. And the only you'd have, of course, like the South Asian engineers or Asian engineers, but they were like still like there's like very similar across.
Yeah, because people would say, well, what do you want me to do? There aren't enough talented people in unusual kind of demographic brackets. But in reality, the way it works is that they are incapable of seeing talent in unusual demographic brackets and assume that it comes with these other demographic characteristics.
Yeah, and I was actually talking to a fellow agency owner the other day about this, is that white men have had the opportunity to make mistakes for many, many years and build and grow and learn as well and get to those positions, whereas we're only just really in the most recent past giving opportunities to non-white, non-male, non-cis,
poor,
exactly, people to make those mistakes. And I think you mentioned in the book as well is that like we can't just, we're judging these guys by very different standards than that. Like all of a sudden, that person that's coming in as being what they do wrong gets transferred to their entire like group.
And exactly, and so this is true. So lots of people, contacted me in the past 2 or 3 months with the simple question, "What about Theresa May, for example?" Right? And personally, I never thought she was very competent. I also never said that all women would make great leaders. But it's interesting that those same people don't realize that the level of scrutiny and the level of generalization that will now occur because she failed to deliver an impossible task that was the product of her predecessors, male leaders, those are just details that we don't want to discuss.
So they call it like the glass cliff or whatever,
correct.
where they bring a woman
into an impossible task, and then you use that failure to support and perpetuate your sexist stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's, I think, Naomi Klein. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, talks about this.
She's Canadian, right?
Or, she's actually from Toronto here. Yes. But she talks about how, like, if you put somebody like Barack Obama as the president, well, okay, now racism is over, so we can go back to... We can go back to our previous
and that is quite interesting. How and when people classify somebody not just as white or black, but also as actually female or male. Sometimes it seems to be de-emphasized. When women don't fit the masculine stereotype of a leader, like in the case of Angela Merkel, they don't see her as the epitome of femininity. So it seems like she's just Angela Merkel, you know. And she's also been very successful. But when they're successful, then that's a problem because she will not be included in the data set that we use to test our archetypes and so forth. But I think what you say is true. There's certainly a vicious circle here. There was a recent study actually that just came out a few weeks ago showing how when somebody has status, when somebody has status because of their income, their class, their gender, we interpret the same behaviors as a sign not just of confidence but also competence, and how that in turn elevates these people's status. And the same happens the other way around. When you don't have it and you're displaying some confidence, they're like, okay, who do you think you are to behave like that? And then it actually lowers your status and that of your class, so it's hard to break.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so back to that sort of how you spread your words, sort of, I'm going to do whatever I can to help.
Thank you.
Help you spread your word, including having you on the podcast.
It's, and this is your area of expertise, not mine, but I remember still when the mantra was, content is king, and, it seems like that is not so true today. I mean, I try to evangelize and spread the word with content, but ultimately the question is, how can you get visibility in a super crowded, saturated world? And then also, how often can you actually reach people who are outside their typical filter bubble, and how often can you persuade people to think differently? Because I think I'm getting lots of positive feedback from people who already believed what I was saying, but they like maybe how I present the argument, and I'm being ignored by people who don't want to hear it, So that to me is a bigger question. Can you change people's minds, or at least engage them intellectually so that they reframe their views?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where like the context is actually king, and that's, when you involve more people who it would resonate with once they get out of that defensive state. And Carlos is here in most conversations. Actually, I act, I think, a little bit more male in our relationship in that I'm doing all the speaking.
I'm perfectly comfortable with that. No issues.
He's the very evolved.
I always say behind every competent woman there is a competent man.
Yeah, exactly. and I think Carlos, I don't know if you want to pipe in here, but you would agree that this message resonates with you because you are a man who is competent and you have that inner confidence that you talk about in the book, but you're not you're not the outer confidence guy, so that it has, in different times in your life affected your ability to grow in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I've had opportunities to be on stage and feel completely incompetent, like doing it, right? And like I haven't pursued it. I'm not that type of person who just wants to be on that situation, but I have admittedly been put into situations where I was like, why the hell am I here? I'm like, I'm not this person that people should be listening to, or,
It's just like the imposter syndrome.
yeah, I definitely have that imposter syndrome.
and I
There's
think
lots of men that have that, right?
Yeah.
So that this message would also resonate with a lot of men. I think the majority of men would be in that situation.
Exactly. And I think, this might be the simplest of all examples, to illustrate how I see competence and how I see confidence and the relationship between them. I think, in areas where it is evident to us, as in the observers or the audience, how much talent somebody has, right? So think about the reality TV shows like The X Factor, Canada's Got Talent, America's Got Talent, where somebody stays on stage and sings for a minute, right? Why does that work? Because anybody within 20 seconds can say, okay, this person can sing or not, right? And the beauty of it is that after we evaluate that, we actually take a look at, okay, do they actually think they're good or not? Are they full of themselves or not? And when you have that ability that you can see the two channels and you can see the talent channel and the confidence channel, you can see not just that we care about talent, but actually that when talent is coupled with modesty and not arrogance, we like the person even more.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, what happens in most everyday office interactions is we don't have that talent channel. We don't have access to the person's talent. So all we see is what they think of themselves or what their external confidence is. And in a way, we're lazy because we're happy to live with that information and just assume that the rest comes with it. But the correlation is very low between them.
That's like the fake it till you make it problem, the social proof. And I mean, there are a lot of articles out there. I think you even pointed them out early in the book that encouraging people to do this because it'll help them get ahead.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I am perplexed really that nobody questions the moral and ethical nature of that advice. I mean, do you want to live in a society where people who fake it succeed?
Right.
And how long are we going to reward them for faking it? Of course, there might be some that are socially astute and they fake it to get in there, and then they will prepare, learn, get better, and develop competence. But in the majority of cases, that doesn't happen. No. You will continue to fake it and you will continue to make it. And then at some point, we're going to realize that the people we have in charge are clueless.
Yeah.
And by the way,
I think we've realized that already. I mean, here in Canada, we look to the U.S. and it's like, I know we don't want to get into politics, but we look to the U.S. and go, what? Like, how is nobody seeing what's happening?
Correct. And, and this is a good example, right? Because, I grew up in Argentina, and by Argentina's standards, the US is, of course, an amazing role model of success. By most of the world standards, if you look at today most outputs, they'll say, well, and yet America is the superpower still today. But the problem is that once you look at a more long-term perspective and you see how things have changed and how a lot of statistics have deteriorated that pertain the well-being, then it's not the same as Canada, right? And then people say, well, but you can't compare both population, etc. So this is what makes the subject so interesting, that we can look at the same country or the same individual and there are so many statistics, but if we just don't bother going there and having a data-driven discussion, then it's going to be a matter of preferences and we won't make much progress.
Yeah. So like it all translates now into a new culture that has emerged over the last couple of years online. This culture of like celebrity, micro celebrity and influencer as well, which we deal with a lot. And, there's the side of that's being used as a marketing tool, but also personally, once again, I've been writing, making videos, doing podcasts, putting out content that I'm putting out that content because as I'm learning, I feel like, oh, I can share this and other people can learn too. Like it's never been for me. I mean, although I do like the benefits of people looking to me as an expert at times, but mostly it's been because I feel like I want to be generous with what I'm like the big ideas that I'm getting that I'm going to share and that somebody else can grow on that. But now I look around, I have a ton of peers, mostly white male peers, who I'm getting my ideas because I'm actually working on projects with clients. I'm doing deep research studies. I'm actually implementing. I have all these white male peers who are just getting on in front of the camera and talking in broad like terms and actually growing way faster than I have ever grown as far as an audience goes. And they get tons of invites to conferences and to contribute to things. But, we look over, and that's fine. We've still been able to build a business. It's frustrating personally, but it's not devastating to me. But then we look over to what's happening in the influencer landscape. I see the same pattern happening over there. People that are talking about what they know versus actually doing something deep and meaningful and useful and truly like helpful are the ones that are getting the most followers, the most deals, the most money, that sort of thing. Like, is that, what do you think that's coming out of now? And where do you think that's going?
Well, so I think
the bubble.
and to me, it's always been interesting to look at kind of the arts, media, let's say the creative industries as something that is simultaneously extremely meritocratic compared to other fields, because show me what you can do. And it's portfolio based. And even now, you would think all these metrics make it more meritocratic. Like how else could you be a YouTube sensation but by doing something that people want to watch?
Right.
So on the one hand, it is at least more meritocratic than the traditional corporate, academic, etc., and where barriers to entry are lower, and everybody now has a platform to have a podcast or a YouTube channel, etc. On the other hand, let's not kid ourselves, because if you're going to become a product or your ideas are going to become a product for consumption, how aligned they are with the status quo and with the mainstream determines your level of success.
Yeah.
And so I think you will find that there are people that are succeeding more than you despite being less talented or producing well, and then there might be some people under you that are saying the same about you because of some privileges that you had that they don't have. So I think it is still better than in other areas, and with my limited but interesting experience working when I was living in the UK with sort of media and advertising, etc., it always struck me as like, wow, people now talk about the gig economy and the sharing economy. And if you do media and creatives and TV or what, it's always been like that. It's like you have a 3 months assignment and then you're going to be hired or not based on what you did and who you know. So I think even the value of the meaning of reputation in creative industries is closer to talent than it is in other fields. Having said that, it's still political and there is still nepotism, no doubt, because I think money at the end of the day calls the shots.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like when you look at what's happening in the U.S. and with Trump being president, there's definitely the confidence over competence in my my opinion, but also there's lots of data that shows. And what's happening with sort of a backlash in general, I feel like it is a backlash to the rise of women and minorities into like higher and higher echelons.
Yes.
So you talk about like, I think the question I asked last night was a little bit like, how does power play into this? It's like, it's not always just this innocent, I am all that and stomping over people, not even understanding and not having empathy, but almost even we need to beat those people back
Yeah.
because they're threatening my position of power too.
Yeah, and I think, here I always interpret senior politicians and certainly heads of states as, in America, sometimes we go as far as to call them entertainers in chief, right? But it is clear that they are a figurehead and spokespeople for mostly the people that voted for them. And that in today's polarized world, it's impossible for any head of state in a democracy to represent both sides or all sides. And it tends to be two sides, right? Yeah. So I think that some of it is deliberately engineered, scripted, orchestrated so that you can appease people and, the same. And I hope this can be interpreted as an apolitical statement. I think the same people who for 8 years suffered because Obama was president and he represents the complete opposite to what they stand for are now getting their time and their revenge because the main narrative is exactly what they wanted to hear, and liberals are suffering from the same reasons. So what's interesting in a way is that if you look at it from that perspective, even two as seemingly different and opposite presidents as Obama and Trump are products of the same zeitgeist. They're products of the same phenomenon. And, well, we also know that they're not as different as their personas indicate because they were even politically in the same party for, so long. And but even when you look at their political personas and what they represent, they are two different sides of the same coin, and Donald Trump is the Barack Obama of the right, much like Obama was the Donald Trump of the left, it's like a really extreme version of their, and I'm sure to a more moderate degree, you have it here. I understand that the at least the opposition to Justin Trudeau is looking for something that is a less kind of Instagrammable, cool, hip, progressive, right? Because it upsets people, much like some people. But what's interesting underpinning this is that there's still the personality cult, and there's still this illusion that one person standing will just fix everything by being themselves or by having values that we agree with, and that's not that easy,
By the way, I'm a little bit to blame for the for the Justin Trudeau personality cult. I actually developed his social digital strategy.
Oh, amazing! Then you have to do mine too. This would be the most important.
And I really, when I was doing that, I really had him lean into those first impressions that people had. So whether it was this young, hip, good-looking guy that was like sociable and selfie, that sort of thing, and then also his legacy from like his father,
correct, yes.
right? So because there were other people who would vote for him just because he was a Trudeau.
Yeah, and then how can you, with those qualities or with those clear, visible aspects of his reputation, how can you convince people that he might also be smart or he might also be, because it almost works to your disadvantage, right?
Yeah, and I think like my theory was because the communications team at the time was like, no, we need to focus on the smart, competent side. And I was like, well, if he has that, then he follows that up. Once he wins the vote because people are emotionally engaged, now he follows it up with the competence. Unfortunately, I feel like Canadians didn't feel the competence.
It's a bit like when, after several failed attempts of winning an Oscar, Brad Pitt decides to make himself look ugly so people can appreciate his acting skills, this happens a lot in movies and sometimes it's like, oh, what a performance because they look bad and then we can switch off this is an attractive person,
I think do you think there's always going to be bias? Do you think there's something inherent?
Well, unfortunately, I think we are heading to amplified bias and I think again, to make the discussion of politics more apolitical, and if we take America as an example, which is the one everybody's familiar with, remember how when Obama won, he was like the social media president because he knew how to use that. It's like, okay, great, but that's clearly not why he won. Then when Trump won, it was like, well, because with Twitter alone, he destroyed all well, not quite, but this goes back to the 60s, I think, the first clear indicator that we wanted entertaining, charismatic, televisual or media-friendly presidents is when JFK defeats Nixon because Nixon is sweating on camera and JFK looks smooth and has a silk suit. And I think from that point onwards, it's only gotten more and more extreme.
So Marshall McLuhan is right.
Yeah,
was right.
I think so.
The messages immediately.
Well, I think so, and I think that's why I was watching on the way to Canada the Netflix documentary on Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and that's why you can't underestimate her. She also seems very smart and ambitious, on that side. But all the other side is like, it's only going to go that way, right? And I remember when I was doing my PhD, I had a flatmate, a housemate who was a German computer scientist. And some evening he said, I have to vote for elections. This was the year like 2000, 2001. And he went onto this website, answered a 50-question survey on his political, economic attitudes, what do you want to do about the environment, healthcare, etc. And after answering that questionnaire, the website said, you have to vote for this candidate. And he went and voted for this candidate, not having seen them on TV. This seems... You tell this story today to somebody and said, this is crazy. And yet, isn't that the logical way that politics should progress, especially in an age where... And so you have these televised debates where there are all these live... In Germany, which also makes sense, right? Because they, they suffered the price of the dark side of charisma for, pretty recently. But I think today we have all these live fact-checking sites that go on while people are having presidential debates. And who cares? Yeah. Nobody cares. It's like, it's like an entertaining feature to say, none of this is true. Yeah. And yet... that doesn't matter because we want to be entertained. We want to connect with people. Yeah. In America, one of the main predictors of who wins the election is who would you rather have a beer with? The current president doesn't drink, but you can have a glass of water with him. Which won't happen either. So why do you care about that?
Or Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Exactly. The age of alternate facts. Well, thank you. This has been, I don't know if we've given you the strategy that you need, but I am definitely down for thinking that through because I love your message. I think it's really important, and I think it's the key to really getting to a place that it's not only that diversity, equality, that sort of stuff is important, but it will make for a better world, a better business, better politics, better economy at the end of the day. You showed me in your book for sure. I hope a whole bunch of people run out and...
Thank you so much. Maybe I can finish by asking you a question, which intrigues me. What is your view on the, Gillette toxic masculinity campaign and that, which certainly got people speaking and thinking, and it's maybe at the intersection between media, campaigns, marketing, branding, and the gender kind of thing.
Yeah, so I thought Gillette made a super brave move. Now, the problem, though, always underpinning any organization that's trying to sell you something, making a super brave move, just like, say, the Nike Kaepernick move, is that you always kind of wonder, are they really trying to change something? Are they really trying to spark a conversation? Or do they just want to sell you more stuff? And then are they manipulating you and manipulating the conversation? So although I applaud Gillette and any brand that takes a stand that is controversial and sparks a conversation, I do also always want to look at what they're doing through a critical eye.
Yeah. And I think but isn't it interesting that often the reaction, so when it backfires is because people will say, you're just trying to make money. Right. But do you need that campaign to realize that? I mean, it's a for-profit corporation, but it's ironic that it's shown by doing the opposite. You actually remind people that you're making money. Whereas if you just say, we're going to make money, it's like, okay, fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been a shift in marketing since the like direct-to-consumer revolution. So Gillette, even though the parent company, I think, bought Dollar Shave Club to get rid of the competition, that competition isn't going to go away, right? There's still, I mean, those razors are still very, very expensive. Both of you guys are like stubbly.
Yes, that's
so
why we don't use,
so
that's why we wouldn't know.
Razors. But you go to, like, if you go and you look at the package, like 3 replacement blades for like $40 or something crazy, and then they have all these alternatives out there, perfectly good blades for $10 or whatever, for a fraction of the price. So there's a lot, and they're going direct to consumer. They don't have to go through all those different channels. So now Gillette and any other company that's out there that is competing with these direct-to-consumer brands has to make, I guess, a bigger stand, differentiate themselves somehow. And so it's
quite interesting. But I agree with you that it was a bold kind of move. And maybe, you've probably
the conversation needs to happen.
It needs to happen. And I think it's interesting that the criticism is like, they are virtue signaling. So that just, it's like, well, but if they are, and it comes at a cost, then it's no longer virtue signaling, because you're putting it out there. But I was surprised that they managed to, do something as bold. Given that it was always, I imagine, very uncertain what results is going to happen.
And we've been talking about femininity for so many years. Somebody has to talk masculinity. I think you do a bit of it, for sure, in the book, from more of the competence, sort of like the professional, like a public persona way. But I think masculinity in general has not been examined as deeply as it should be. And I don't know, like, I support, even if it's somehow like misinformed, misaligned, I do support Gillette and anybody in the future to tackle that conversation. Like we were talking about earlier, with great power comes great responsibility. If you are going to spend money on just selling and actually sparking a conversation, I would rather see, even if you stumble, go down the sparking the conversation route.
Excellent. Well, it's been great to chat.
Yeah, it's been great to chat with you, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chamorro, for meeting with us and coming on the show. That was excellent.
Oh my God, I'm like completely, my brain is like on fire. I really want to get his word out there. It's so important. And it's not because of, his message is clear. It's not about holding men back so that women can go forward. It's really about creating better leaders for the future. And so that includes a lot of men who have previously been held back in positions as well. I think his message is so important. I hope you guys go out. It's actually a very easy book to read. He's a great writer, lots of fun stories. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders? We'll put a link in the show notes. He also has a TED Talk if you want to watch the condensed version of it before you pick up the book.
Yeah, we'll make sure to have all the links on the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this episode, as always, please do give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts and follow us on
Twitter, Instagram, or even Facebook. Shudder. Have a good one.